Most people in the world are unaware of the fact that many Orthodox Jews oppose the state of Israel and protest against the occupation of Palestine. They believe that Zionism is a danger to peace in the world. One of them is Rabbi Joseph Antebi, who was tortured by Zionists. I met him on the last day of Hanukkah in his apartment in Amsterdam.
And you didn't even have time to make a cup of coffee. We're back. Now, we reported last week that Steve Marsh, who is an organic farmer near Perth in Australia, lost his organic certification after his fields were contaminated by his neighbour's GM modified crops. Marsh sued his neighbour, a guy called Michael Baxter, following the loss of organic certification on 70% of his land in 2010, after parts of canola plants and seed from Baxter's farm blew onto his property. He claimed the loss had cost him financially. But last week, Judge Kenneth Martin ruled that genetically modified canola was approved for farming back in 2010, and Baxter did nothing wrong in cultivating and harvesting the crop. It was an incredible verdict, really. This afternoon, I caught up with Scott Kinnear, the director of Safe Food Foundation Australia, and I asked him, first of all, to sum up the case. Steve Marsh, tell us about his case against his neighbour Michael Baxter and the judgment, which of course came in last week.
Steve Marsh is an organic farmer in Western Australia. In late 2010, after the Western Australian government authorised GM canola, his farm was contaminated by GM canola cut and mowed and raked, which blew across 70% of his farm. As an organic certified grower, he notified his certified operator, and they inspected his farm and decided that that level of contamination of hundreds of plants and thousands of seeds was far too extensive for him to keep his certification. So they decertified him for a period of time. He then lost his premium income. In particular, he had a very valuable organic oats crop, and he suffered loss and damage through no fault of his own, through his neighbour's actions. He then sought redress in the Supreme Court of Western Australia, and it's the world's first case of an organic farmer suing a GM farmer. And in particular, his case focused around two things. One, that the GM farmer could have done more by planting further back without, as he did, he planted right next to Steve's boundary. And he also could have headed the canola through a traditional harvester rather than mowing and raking the canola. And those two actions, Steve's case said to the court, were reckless and indifferent to Steve's organic certification. And Steve had gone through a long process to advise his neighbour in the years leading up to this planting, and he had also gone to great lengths to put signs up, take ads out in newspapers, that sort of thing. So the neighbour very much knew, Michael Baxter knew, that it was an issue for Steve, and yet he continued to plant on the boundary and mow and rake the canola. And furthermore, the Western Australian government guidelines also state that he should consult with his neighbours and try and develop plans to minimise contamination. So really it looked at all appearances to be a case that was very strong in the court under common law, the negligence and the trespass elements of common law and nuisance elements of common law were what was brought into play.
So if you asked a farmer anywhere in Australia or anywhere in the world, for example, did Michael Baxter follow best practice in terms of making sure that he didn't contaminate his neighbour's crop? It looks like he didn't do anything like that at all. In fact, you could almost say, looking at the facts, because of course the case is over now, the facts actually show to a normal person that it was negligence. He certainly didn't follow best practice. It was, I won't use the word contempt. I don't know what his relationship was like with his neighbour, but certainly he didn't seem to care less whether there would be contamination or not.
He didn't do anything at all to try and stop it. And I think we can use some very strong words to describe that. It was reckless. It was indifferent. It certainly caused the harm. And this is the basis of Steve's case. And Steve made every effort to talk to this guy. He turned his back on Steve and showed complete disregard. And that goes against the guidelines, even though the guidelines are voluntary. It goes against the history of farmer-to-farmer relations across the world. Common law is well versed in looking at farmer issues. The bull jumping the fence, chemical trespass, disease that spreads from one farm to another. There's plenty of cases where farmers are held liable for their indifferent and reckless actions. We thought this case was a no-brainer. It was one that Steve had excellent prospects of winning. Unfortunately, the bad news is that in the first round in the Supreme Court in front of one judge, he did lose that case. And the judge found against Steve in every quarter possible, completely dismissed the case. And this
is Judge Kenneth Martin now. And there's a bit of a stinger. There was a bit of a stinger in the tail for Steve, wasn't there, Scott? Because I believe that not only did he lose the case, but Martin denied him an injunction to protect his crops being contaminated again. That's extraordinary, that. How did he come to that conclusion?
Well, we don't know what was going on in his head. I will say that the lawyers we've been working with have been fantastic, Slater and Gordon, and they advised us 2 years ago before the litigation commenced that the first round in front of a single judge always has risk, because that judge can be subjective. They can have personal opinions and they can exercise that. It appears in reading the judgment that's what the judge has done. Kenneth Martin has exercised his subjective personal opinion and he did not want to assign any millimetre of responsibility to the GM farmer. And he said that Steve's issue is really something he should take up with his organic certifier, who should not have decertified him. And therein lies a massive problem, because the organic certifier is acting out of a standard and a system of certification. And that system's very strong in Australia. It's less strong in the United States, where they certifiers there look the other way. And we think that that is a massive problem for organic products in North America, because it's not far away that they will be named and shamed as the issue of GM comes to the forefront, and it certainly is coming to the forefront. As global concerns about GM have never been higher in terms of health impacts, and labelling now in the United States has hit the headlines, and Americans now know they are eating GM. And what happens in America affects the rest of the world in terms of GM. And in Europe, fortunately, you guys there, you are holding the line. But we are very strict in Australia, and we want to continue to be strict, and the organic certifier is not backing down on this decision, despite Kenneth Martin's pronouncement that Steve should sue his certifier and should seek damages from them. It's not appropriate, and we have to look at, well, what does the average consumer want? Is a consumer, an organic consumer, happy to buy produce from Steve when he's had thousands of seeds dropped all over his farm and hundreds of plants blown all over it? And I think the average consumer would say, organic consumer would adamantly say, no, that's not all right.
Scott, we'll talk about Monsanto in a second. Let's talk about Judge Kenneth Martin saying that there was no evidence of genetic transference. Now, you're going to have to explain, for me as much as for any of our viewers, because I really don't understand a lot of this terminology. I get the premise of what genetic transference means. But what advice did Kenneth Martin get to come to that conclusion, and from whom? When we've seen over the years, credible scientists and credible agricultural scientists say that, well, when there is contamination, there is genetic transference. How could he come to that conclusion?
Well, he could, because Steve was not growing organic canola. That's the Kenneth Martin saying, because there was no canola there was no mixing of the DNA. But in this particular instance, that's not the problem. The problem is that GM canola plants started popping up on Steve's farm. And with thousands of seeds deposited right across his farm, and he has pasture as well as grain crops, there was no way of knowing how many GM canola plants would pop up. His sheep would be eating them. They'd pop up in his wheat and in his oats. Some of those would flower, some of those would produce seed, and they could end up in the grains. And it was that issue of contamination of canola with wheat or canola with oats or sheep eating canola, GM canola, that was the problem. And Kenneth Martin overlooked that in his judgment. He didn't want to look at that. He said, oh, that's not really an issue in his view. He was only interested if there was DNA transference or mixing. So that's where his narrow-minded view of contamination was based.
Which
and then he also
which leads you to believe that he might, Steve Marsh might very well have reason to be optimistic about an appeal. I got to mention Monsanto. Monsanto bankrolled Michael Baxter's case, I believe. They bankrolled his defence That's been reported over here. Is that true, A? And B, did that set some sort of precedent, Monsanto doing that? And, you know, that because some might say, in fact, I'll say that that's pretty unpalatable, that Monsanto getting involved and bankrolling this guy.
Well, it is unpalatable because they have deep pockets, and last time I spoke to someone, they have a budget line annually for legal action of $200 million a year. So, you know, these deep pockets, there are a lot of money that they throw around in the courts, mainly suing farmers in North America who they allege are using their product without paying royalties. In Australia, it's been alleged, and over there, that Monsanto funded the case, bankrolled it. We don't know for sure, but certainly it's been reported in some of the media. Other media have said Monsanto's single one-line response was, "We are not a party to the case." That simply means that they are not a named litigant in the proceedings. It doesn't answer the question, did you fund Michael Baxter's defence? So we make the assumption that they may have, but we're not sure that they did do that. If they did, perhaps it is a precedent, I'm not sure. Certainly this case is unique. It's the first time an organic farmer has sued a GM farmer. And the case had to be run under common law. And you also referenced or mentioned an appeal. And Steve's lawyers are looking closely at that. Hopefully within the next 2 days a decision will be made. There are errors in law at the initial analysis. And that's the sort of thing that you need to have to be able to mount an appeal. And if he does, we'll be mounting a fundraising campaign to support that appeal, because Steve, at this stage, is going to have a big cost order against him, and he could lose his farm to try and stand up for our rights.
An absolute tragedy, that, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Look, Monsanto don't talk to anybody anymore. We were talking the other day, you and I, and then I got speaking to somebody whom I know operates a dairy farm in Ireland. And they were saying that back in the day, you know, when Monsanto first became known, they were very friendly, they were very out there, they were very, I think you mentioned this to me the other day, they were very touchy-feely with people and with the media, especially local media in places. Not so much anymore. We're at the bottom of a big queue now to try and get to speak to people from Monsanto. But they argue, and I've got to say this, that there's never been any evidence, there is no evidence whatsoever scientifically, that genetically modified crops hurt or harm anybody. They say they spend millions and millions on extensive educational programs all over the world, in the poorest places in the world. They're very benevolent, they say. They say they fund grant research for students. They say they can prove all of this. We're democratic, they say. We work with governments. We don't try to subvert democracy. Now we could laugh at that and say, well, you spend a lot of money lobbying, especially in Washington, D.C., but Monsanto would probably say, well, so does everybody else. Those are the rules. And they say that they've proved that they've made agriculture more sustainable around the world, and that farmers are getting more from their land. That's what they say, even though they won't say it to us today. It's what they say on their website.
Well, they would say that. They're out there to make a buck, and their share price is high and their profits are massive, and they own something more than 20% of the world's seeds. And they'd like to own 100% of the world's seeds, no doubt. And they will take over our food supply, and we will eat what we're told to eat, and we'll pay a fortune for it if they get their way. And every single one of those statements you've said can be counted. The body of evidence that you refer to is there, and it is starting to mount, and it's independently funded. Every single time adverse evidence comes out against GM, the scientist is jumped up and down on by an enormous online campaign and vindictive campaign to attack them. They are attacked and vilified. It happens every single time. Nonetheless, there is evidence there of laboratory impacts. Animals fed GM foods are getting harmed. There's no doubt about it. Then you look at Roundup. There's a stack of evidence to show that Roundup affects all sorts of the bodily most important functions at the very lowest levels.
Is that peer-reviewed evidence, Scott? I hate to interrupt you, but I got to jump in. In the absence of Monsanto being here, I've got to ask that question. Is there peer-reviewed evidence that animals are getting harmed in their labs, and that can be shown, demonstrably proven?
Yeah, there is. There's a small body of peer-reviewed evidence, and the most famous one is Seralini's, which has been retracted by the journal, as most people would know, and have a look at that decision. You know, they retracted that article on the basis on the most extraordinary set of criteria that's never been applied to a scientific paper ever, And if they applied that criteria, we'd lose a third of all of the science that's ever been published, including Watson and Crick's seminal work on DNA would never have been published. So we've got this, science is not true. Science is obliterated by the corporate interest these days and follows the corporate interest. It does not follow the public interest, and that's the problem. And we have funded in the past research into feeding trials, and Judy Carman's has a published paper out. Now, we're looking for links in terms of Roundup. There's plenty of evidence to show Roundup's causing harm. We're looking for the mechanism of harm. How does it actually work? And Roundup is intricately linked into Monsanto's GM products because of the GM Roundup-ready products such as the canola in Australia. So look, every single thing you mentioned about Monsanto, about what they're trying to do, it can be counted. I mean, feeding the world is going to come from access to land in countries where people are desperately needing access to land to move away from the monocultures, the cash crops. I mean, look at Brazil and Argentina. GM crops are all over the place, soybeans. All that's done for those countries caused starvation and famine and poverty to go through the roof.
Well, Monsanto might argue that that they might say, to quote the words of a well-known Smith song, they might say these things take time. They might say that. Now, look, I'd love to be speaking to you all day, and we'll definitely be inviting you back on the programme, Scott, definitely. Love chatting with you. I want to ask you about, you mentioned Europe, and you said, right, Richie, there's fight back, there's pushback against Monsanto in Europe. What about trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and provisions in that corporations could sue governments if they don't like rulings that government make, decisions that governments make, if they don't like policy written by governments? I understand in New Zealand, there was a poll a couple of years ago where this was put to New Zealanders, asking them did they think it was a good idea that corporations could sue governments, and unsurprisingly, nearly 2/3 of New Zealanders said no, it isn't. Do you worry as a farmer, Scott, that the likes of Monsanto will use provisions within the TPP to get stuck into Europe?
Absolutely. Monsanto's been helping draft the TPP in secret, and this is outrageous. The people are not involved in that drafting process. And as we understand it, provision has been made for corporations, if they lose profits through any restraint in trade, that they can sue to recover that loss of profits, no questions asked. It may even be easier than that. It may just be a compensation scheme where they don't even need to run into court, which would be outrageous. And even labelling GM crops or GM foods in the marketplace could easily be perceived as a restraint in trade. And what's happening is corporations have become bigger than governments. Apple has more money than the US government in its vaults. And imagine if Monsanto had more money than the US government.
Scott,
on the world.
Is there any hard evidence, Scott? Is there any documentary evidence that Monsanto are doing this sort of thing in secret? Anybody talking?
Well, it's been reported in the Australian press many, many times that the negotiations over the Pacific TPP, that they're involved in that drafting process, and no one's denied it that I've been aware of in the media, and that's extraordinary. And many other corporations are involved in this as well. At the end of the day, these partnerships really are about corporations, so of course they will be involved. It's no way is it considered to be something that's here for the betterment of humankind, for the reduction or elimination of poverty, for the betterment of the environment or anything like that. It's all about trade, and trade at the end of the day is about corporation.
So we're looking at a situation where as the European project here, for example, rumbles on and on and on. I mean, I have a personal opinion on the European Union. I'm not going to express it here. But we could have a situation where companies like Monsanto really only need to go to Brussels and say, listen, we're not happy that the French won't allow us access to their markets. We're not happy that the French are saying things about GM foods because we believe we're being prejudiced against, we're being shown prejudice. Therefore, that's got to stop. Brussels will issue directives and Monsanto can do what they want in France. And that might sound like a horror story, Scott, but it is in fact a possibility, isn't it?
It is very much a possibility, and I think Bulgaria at the moment is under pressure and has announced just yesterday that they're going to resist any attempts to force Monsanto's products on them. It is a horrible thought. And I think that the most important thing to remember is that GM is rolling forward. They're developing GM wheat now in Australia, and they want to be the first country in the world to grow that commercially. And you've got to look at North American, at the experience there. GM canola or non-GM canola in Canada is virtually non-existent. The contamination rates now of the non-GM seed in Canada are up routinely above 5%. The International Grain Traders Association is being lobbied by the US grain farmers organisations to lift the contamination threshold of GM in non-GM grains from 1% to 5%. And that's because they've got problems well above 1% now. And so the logical consequence is GM gets grown on wider and wider acreages, and it shifts into wheat, which is a cereal crop, which is very different to canola. There's going to be a lot more contamination in cereals. The logical consequence is that in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years' time, the percentage of GM in our diet will be substantial, whether we like it or not. So the Steve Marsh's case is all about trying to get some legal protections in place. Failing that, we need legislative protections. And what you've just talked about is the breaking down of those legislative protections, which are working at the moment in Europe. So the people have got to stand up. There's no question that we have to stand up.
It's just got to be made aware of it, Scott. The problem is, you know, you don't often turn on Channel 4 in Britain or BBC or ITV and see a discussion about this sort of thing. Scott, I'd love you to come back on the programme. We're just about out of time. Please do come back on again very soon and talk to us about GM foods and you know, your take on them because it's a very serious issue. Really enjoyed talking to you today. Thanks for coming on the programme.
Right. Thanks for the interview, Richie.
Right, so that was Scott Kinnear talking to us earlier on about the Steve Marsh, I should say, case in Australia. He mentioned there may very well be an appeal to that, and of course we'll follow that with great interest. We obviously invited Steve Marsh himself to come on the programme and talk about his own experience in that case. I mean, it's staggering when you think, really, that Monsanto bankrolled his opponents in that court case. But he's chosen not to do any one-to-one interviews with the media while he's considering an appeal. I suppose we can totally understand that. You're with the People's Voice. If you're just joining the programme, let me tell you, you've missed some really interesting people tonight. Margaretta Darcy, what a fabulous lady, speaking to us earlier on about her time in Mountjoy Jail for protesting against US military's use of Shannon Airport in Ireland. You also missed Richard Gage from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And we also spoke, of course, with Luke Rutkowski from We Are Change. We are due to speak to Robert M. Price, who's a renowned theologian, on the programme in the final segment. We're having a bit of difficulty getting him up, but we'll persevere with that. There might be a bit of trouble his end. We'll, as I said, we'll keep working on that in the meantime.